Hi all, our notable game today is an absolutely magnificent positional masterpiece. This could actually change your perception completely or significantly of light square play in chess, what that involves, the implications of it, and even when pieces move, where do they move to, light squares or dark squares. You may have not even thought of that before as significant in relation to a light square strategy. This is an unbelievable demonstration of light square strategy. So the game I'm talking about is Anatoly Karpov against Garry Kasparov in no less a World Chess Championship match, Moscow, 1985, Game 4. Let's have a look at this fantastic game. D4 from Karpov. D5, classical start. C4, E6, knight C3. Bishop E7. With this move order, white is discouraged from bishop G5, trying to get white to do something else, of course, instead of the usual knight F6. In fact, in my book, this finesse bishop E7 is still third popular. It's a recent trend. Historically, knight F6 is the most trodden move, so there's a little finesse in the opening. Knight F3 is played, knight F6, but then we transpose back anyway, bishop G5. And Kasparov plays H6 early here, chasing that bishop. This is the most common move. Castling is also very, very popular, but actually H6 seems to be the most popular. And the two options, white can either retreat or bishop takes. Now, it's often the case that if you capture a knight with a dark square bishop, you're increasing your light square pressure, and that is what is played here. Bishop takes F6. So it can be part of a light square strategy to give up your dark square bishop like this. You can see immediately there's more pressure on D5 without a defensive knight on D5, protecting D5. So E3. Black has a trump card though, that bishop. If you can liberate the bishop later with C5, trying to open up the bishop on the diagonal, that's black's trump card. White does seem to have more pressure now on the light squares, and the knights are ready to take outpost squares in this variation. Quite often C5 and E5, very interesting outpost squares to secure black castles. And instead of moving the bishop here, you might think moving the bishop, well, black could be ready to take on C4, for example. We have a waiting move, Queen C2. It seems the waiting moves Rook C1, Queen D2 or C2 are the most popular moves in this position. Moving the bishop to D3 or E2 is much rarer actually than say Rook C1. That's actually the top most used move. But here we see the waiting move Queen C2. And Kasparov plays knight A6, which not only facilitates C5 but maybe also knight B4 could be a nuisance in the right circumstances. Now prophylaxis type move against C5 to break open this bishop is played. Rook D1, ready to capture away from the center to put more pressure on D5. Kasparov plays this anyway. He wants to liberate his pieces. We have D takes C5, so a temporary pawn sack. Now Queen A5, putting pressure on the C3 knight, pinning the knight. We have C takes D5, and black regains the pawn. With the threat of knight A4 here, it's too dangerous to try and win some more material. White needs to consolidate. This is actually threatened, knight A4, using the pin. If, for example, bishop E2, absolutely check this 100%. Knight A4 is playable here. You see that queen takes A4, there's bishop takes C3 check, and we're winning the queen. So that's a playable move which could be a nuisance. So the routine move bishop E2 is kind of ruled out. We have Queen D2 unpinning the knight on C3. Rook D8. And the queen looks a bit scarily placed in relation to that rook. We have knight D4 blocking that D file and encouraging black to open up this bishop at the expense of having the dreaded isolated queen's pawn. Of course, rook takes D5 is no longer possible with the unpin. We can take Knight takes d5. So e takes. Black has the isolated queen's pawn. Bishop e2, because it could be useful to go to f3 later and then outside of the glare of the knight as well. Queen b6 is played. Getting out of potential counter tactics. The queen could be a tactical vulnerability at some point on a5 with knight moves like knight takes d5. So it's getting out of the way, keeping pressure on b2. White castles. And now knight e4. White doesn't want to take this. If he takes it, d takes. That's quite pleasant actually for black with the bishop pair. Now, even though it looks like quite an aggressive knight, White's next move, queen c2, has the threat of knight takes d5, hitting the queen, and then taking on e4. Because the knight controls f5, there's no bishop f5. So Kasparov actually takes on c3. Karpov keeps the pawn structure intact. Queen takes c3. Bishop e6. And now rook c8 to harass the queen. The queen prepares for this. Queen c2 to be able to tuck away on b1. This is what happens. Rook a c8, queen b1. Rook c7. The rooks may double. Rook d2. Rooks like being doubled. But is there an entry point which is meaningful here? That's the key question about doubling rooks. Now this is the start of a fantastic series of moves which you'll notice all happen to be on light squares. Knight takes e6 is played, getting rid of black's isolated queen's pawn. And you might wonder, why on earth would white want to do this? I'm trying to illustrate these diagonals that are now more sensitive. This diagonal with e6 as the target. Potentially this diagonal. White has the light square bishop, black the dark square one. The light square play is probably the finest, one of the finest you've ever see on the chessboard now. Look at White's moves, and they're all on light squares for quite some time now. Bishop g4 on a light square. Of course, White has the light square bishop, so you'd expect statistically all the bishop moves, of course, are going to be on light squares. But let's continue. Rook c4 is played, hitting the bishop. And the bishop is not tucked here. It's protected with h3, which gives the king some air as well. You'll note that's kind of an outpost with the absence of the f-pawn, and the h-pawn's not going anywhere soon to kick the bishop. The bishop's quite happy there for a moment. Queen c6, trebling, but is there an entry point which is useful? Queen d3 now is played, another light square play. That actually gives options, because actually black may be indulging in something like rook c1, so it gets out of the way. Let's just check that. Black has got, of course, dark square pressure. If we play a move like that, then maybe this could be useful. Not here, pardon me, because this totally backfires because the bishop takes e6. But anyway, in the future, at some point, rook c1 might be useful. So anyway, it's a move which gets out of the way of that one entry point. In principle, queen d3. We have king h8. Rook fd1 on the light square, putting pressure on a light square pawn. a5. What is Kasparov doing in this position? b3, another light square, hitting the rook. Rook c3, queen e2. Now it looks as though e4 would be quite useful to try and break through to the 7th rank or re-isolate the queen's pawn. Rook f8. Now a fantastic manoeuvre on the light squares. This diagonal in particular, it'd be nice to have a queen and bishop battery. This next move, bishop h5. For bishop g6 to pivot via that square to come down on this diagonal, either b1 or say d3 temporarily, for the queen to join the bishop later. b5. Bishop g6, so the bishop can go to b1 or maybe just to d3, depending on what black does. Bishop d8. bishop d3. There's no real speed point of bishop e1 for queen d3 because of course black's controlling d3, so the bishop just returns here with tempo, encouraging this pawn to move forward. And now queen g4, white is threatening now queen g6 to threaten mate on a light square. This is parried with queen e8, and again another light square move, e4 to try and isolate the pawn, and then maybe bishop g6 to win this pawn. The rooks are really doubled against d5. Bishop g5, it's easier for Karpov to slip up here against this simple looking threat. If rook e2, for example, which looks kind of logical, it runs into rook f4. Ouch. White has got to be careful, and this is like end of game after d takes. There's this pin here. It's end of game. So white's got to be very careful though about black's threats. Karpov plays rook c2. We have rook takes c2, a pair of rooks come off. Queen c6. Queen e2, another light square move. Threatening things like e takes and queen d3, which will double the attack d5 and h7. Queen c5. Black is threatening something now. If e takes, then there's rook takes f2. This is black's threat, which needs to be avoided on the dark squares. White avoids that with rook f1, seemingly innocent defensive move. Queen c3. Is white doing anything? Well, white is isolating the queen's pawn again and has opened up that diagonal. Bishop drops back to b1, and now without the queen having the responsibility of the bishop, she can go away now to either a6 or e6 and maybe join the bishop again for a battery here on this diagonal. So another light square move. Queen d2. You can see why this game was actually nicknamed Light Square Symphony on chessgames.com already. And it's here the Light Square Symphony takes a breathing pause at move 39. A quiet little pause with queen e5. Finally a move involving a dark square. The funny thing is, black is in a kind of what I'd call weakness of the last move, light square threats, starting again, zugzwang. In other words, whatever black plays, the sensible moves that black has available will start again a series of issues and threats on the light squares. Black tries rook d8, bishop f6, also like queen f5, but both of these moves, queen f5, and there's light square threats that are emerging again. If the queen moves, the queen's responsible for the d pawn. So we have rook d8 giving up f5 for the queen. It was guarding f5, the weakness of the last move. Queen f5 threatening mate. The king evacuates himself. Look at where black pieces are on dark squares here. All of white's pieces on light squares. And the movements on light squares reignite. Check. Now if here bishop g6 looks very, very dangerous, because then there's queen f7, and if needed, it probably isn't. Well, there's rook e1 for queen e8, so this is very, very dangerous if king goes to f8. I just want to prove that to you 100%. Why the king goes back to h8 here. King f8, bishop g6 is actually a mate in 6. Queen f4, rook e1 threatening. Queen e8 mating. This is actually a forced mate here, this position. Black has to give up material desperately. So let's turn that off. So in this position, the king steps back. Queen g6, another light square threat. Check. Now, is this going to be a draw? No. Bishop f5. The bishop is now going to reroute again on this diagonal after queen g6, bishop e6. Black tries to defend with queen c3 here. Queen g6. King steps out of the mate threat. Check. The king has to go back to h8 here. Bishop f5. King g8. How does white make progress? This is time for another dark square pause, which will reignite a new wave of light square threats and some other not so insignificant direct threats to this bishop as well. This next move is masterful. I wonder if you can guess it. It's a quiet move. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, starting from now. Karpov to play. How do you make progress? Okay, one problem for White's position. Not all the pieces are on light squares. The king is on a dark square. You want to get the king away from the dark square pieces. And this next move, g3, the king can actually go to g2. And that also facilitates, of course, f4. g3 facilitates f4 to be able to kick this bishop. So it's stepping up the pressure. The intensity of the symphony is going to be even more now. So king f8, king g2, f4 is now in the mix. The king is on the light square as well, joining its fellow pieces. Queen f6, queen h7. So f4 is now immediately threatened, trapping the bishop. An escape route for the bishop is made way. h4, bishop d2. It's a loose piece, awkward. It could be subject to double attacks or direct attacks. Rook d1, gaining an important tempo to switch the rook in potentially. Very important tempo. The queen is helpless to defend it. The bishop has to just move. Rook d3, now rook f3. Finally, artillery is brought to help the queen and bishop. A heavy rook artillery on the f file for rook f3. Black tries to defend with his rook d6. Rook f3. Protected by the king, which is on the light square as well. So this is really meaningful now. Bishop g6, which would embarrass the queen, pinning the queen. King has to step out of the way. We have queen h8 now. The queen can go over here, cutting. It's cut the whole back row off from the king. So rook e3 and rook b8 are strong. Queen a8 are pretty strong moves now. Black tries to stop at least the rook e3 resource, plays d4, but of course this weakens this diagonal. If we look at this position, it's very, very difficult if d4 isn't played. As a token example, if h5, queen a8, this is very, very difficult attacking, and these squares, the king is in big trouble here. As another example, say bishop d4, queen a8, just to follow it through a bit, check. It's lethal, bishop d7, this discovery on the queen. So this d4 is played. Queen c8, numerous threats. Queen c7 is the principal one, picking up the rook. The rook gets out of the way. Check on a dark square. King e8. Now another dark square. We've moved into dark square play, but rook e4, we're converging around the king. A mating net might require a combination of light and dark square play to cover all the escape squares, logically. Queen b7, check. King f7, light square check again. King f8. Bishop h7, the mating net is starting to be sealed. The exits are all being covered. Queen g8 threatened. Mate. Rook f7 to prevent that. Queen e6 threatening mate again with queen e8. Queen d7 to prevent that. And the game ends here. What does Karpov play in this position? To which there is no defense. I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video here. Starting from now. White to play and win. What does white play in this position? Okay. Queen e5, a dark square, alas, but it does threaten queen b8 check, and it keeps an eye on the light square as well. Black is actually defenseless here. Black had to resign. Let's look at various defenses to show this. If rook f6, check, and what is happening here? If the king moves, That's checkmate on the light square. So that's the end of that. The queen will just get out of the way. That's hopeless. D3, we have the check. It's hopeless. Let's just run through some moves. Rook e7. In this case, rook f4 check forces the rook back. Check here, queen e8. Check here, forces two pins simultaneously. Black is really pinned to the wall here. And white can now play rook takes f7. King takes. Bishop g6 check. The king must keep protecting the queen here. Queen b8 check. And that's mating after queen e8. So that's absolutely diabolical. So that was on rook e7. It's inadequate. On queen d8, we have a dark square check. And in this position, black pins quite heavily. White can play here. Bishop g6. The king has the responsibility to hold on to the rook. So it can't step back here. And white is simply threatening here. Rook takes e7 and queen c8. So say a4, rook takes e7, queen c8 check, coordinating on e8, mating. Black is entirely defenseless, it seems, after queen e5. A beautiful centralizing queen finish to this game. For me, this is an extremely vivid demonstration of light square play by Anatoly Karpov. It's having to form the mating net and the crushing pins where some dark square moves are needed. But what a huge succession of light square moves you can see through this game, interrupted with a pause at one point when the king wants to get onto a light square and support things like f4. A magnificent game and played in a World Chess Championship, no less. I believe it is one of the greatest Anatoly Karpov games featured so far on this channel. What do you think? Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.